I'm recording.
Recording in progress.
Great. Okay, Allison, you want to kick us off?
Okay. Hi, everyone. We are presenting a case formulation of Will Hunting. We're basing it off of the movie Good Will Hunting. In this presentation, we will go through the theory that we applied here, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, a background on Will Hunting himself, including social and relational context, presenting problems, and personality and problem development, as well as any presenting concerns for therapy, the therapy and treatment approach, the therapy and treatment goals and outcomes that we're looking for, and any gaps and limitations of cognitive behavioral therapy that might come about in this therapeutic session. This presentation is by Will, Allison, Annie, and Maria. So an introduction to cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short. Cognitive behavioral therapy is what we chose to apply to Will Hunting for his therapeutic sessions. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an evidence-based approach, and it focuses on the connection between a person's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, and uses empirical data to support its cognitive and behavioral interventions. So it really focuses on that person's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And cognitive behavioral therapy is based around the idea that psychological distress is maintained by unhelpful thinking patterns and maladaptive behaviors that reinforce negative beliefs. The use of cognitive behavioral therapy helps clients both identify and challenge their unhelpful thinking patterns and replace them with healthier alternatives and develop proper coping strategies. We do this by using structured, goal-oriented sessions, and cognitive behavioral therapists work towards helping clients to improve their emotional regulation and problem-solving skills. The goal is to eventually have the client be able to identify their automatic thoughts and prevent bad feelings that lead to maladaptive behaviors. That way, the client can learn how to use these interventions that were provided to them in the therapy sessions and start to work towards identifying those thoughts and feelings and be able to stop them while they're out in their day-to-day life outside of therapy. Next slide. So a client summary, background and history on our client here, Will Hunting. Will Hunting is a new client at the office, and he is a 20-year-old working class male. He lives in South Boston. Will works as a janitor at MIT. However, he is a mathematical genius with intellectual abilities. Although Will is very intelligent, he has not pursued a higher education. He has a long history of trauma and adversity, and he has experienced severe physical abuse and neglect as a child, and he's been through many foster homes. Will's childhood was very unstable and unpredictable, and he has been involved in the legal system as he has a criminal record for assaulting a police officer. Will's assault-related charges reflect his ongoing behavioral issues and his difficulty regulating his anger. Next slide. So some social and relational context for Will Hunting is that Will has a really strong social support system, especially through his friend Chucky. He provides a lot of support for Will. However, Will's friend group does give him stable connections, which are really important. They do reinforce his comfort in staying in a familiar environment. It causes him to really not move outside of this familiar environment and push himself to do more, although he has the abilities to do so. He feels very comfortable within his environment and with his friend group. Will develops a romantic relationship with Skylar. Skylar is a Harvard student, and the relationship with Skylar introduced Will to vulnerability as there was emotional closeness, which Will struggled with immensely, and it caused him to ultimately push Skylar away because of that emotional closeness. When Will interacts with people on a more professional level, including those that are professors, psychologists, and legal authority. He is very defensive and sarcastic. And so it's important that we find an emotional safety net here and accept the professional role of Will's therapist to be able to properly work with him in a proper setting to be able to help him. Next slide. So some presenting problems that Will has here include impulsive aggression and anger, legal involvement, relational avoidance, defensiveness with authority, and underachievement and stagnation. So looking at his impulsive aggression and anger, Will has severe difficulty regulating his anger. It manifests in impulsive aggression and ongoing behavioral issues. This leads him into having legal involvement where he now has a criminal record, specifically because he did assault a police officer. And so now he has assault related charges and is going through the criminal justice system for those charges. Will's relational avoidance really shows his fear of abandonment and rejection. If people get too close to him, he fears the abandonment and therefore he pushes people away, which was the ultimate cause of him pushing Skylar away because he really struggled with that emotional closeness. Will's defensiveness with authority shows his symptoms of trauma. He uses sarcasm and defensiveness as this barrier to not show who he really is and what he's feeling underneath. And so when he's interacting with people on a professional level, he really has difficulties and will use that sarcasm as that barrier to not show people how he's truly feeling. And his underachievement and stagnation, that shows Will's low self-worth and his self-sabotage, and that leads him to feeling like he's not good enough. Although Will has the intelligence to do so much more in his life, he feels that when success is possible, he really avoids it because that's getting him outside of that comfort zone that he has there.
Thank you, Allison. So now we're going to move on to the personality and problem development for Will. So as Allison mentioned, CBT works with different aspects such as core beliefs, cognitive distortions, or maladaptive thoughts, emotional responses, and some behavioral patterns. For Will, a core belief that Will presents is that no one can truly understand or help him. Another core belief noted is that Will believes he's to blame for his own misfortunes, including his childhood abuse. In regards to cognitive distortions, we can see different negative thought patterns, all or nothing thinking, some emotional reasoning. He often discounts the positive, and we can see also some self-labeling. In emotional responses, he has a great fear of abandonment, which does not permit him to have meaningful connections. And some behavioral patterns that we notice are clear, defined attitude. Will's aggression is also learned behavior resulting from the abuse he endured, and it's a survival mechanism or coping skill that he acquired that was reinforced throughout his early developmental years. He also has a history of noncompliance, as Allison also mentioned, and he has a deep distrust to authoritative figures. So how his personality developed, Will initially uses his intellect as a defense mechanism to push people away as a result of a severe childhood abuse and neglect. And we see throughout the movie in Good Will Hunting that this therapy sessions that he was having later on in the movie help break down those emotional walls. A major turning point for Will is learning to trust, specifically in his romantic relationship with Skylar. He moves from fear of abandonment to more accepting behavior, and he learns that he's more worthy of love and connection. Will moves beyond his pressure from Professor Lembeau in his professional environment to use his genius for academic purposes. he finds his own self-determined path, choosing to leave his old life behind for personal happiness and growth. And a big part of his development also is the sense of belonging. He, within his social group and within his friend group, one of the characters, Sean, or also known as Chucky, he challenges Will, and this conversation with Chucky really sparked Will's growth. Will's journey definitely highlights that true personal development requires confronting the past traumas and these core beliefs, embracing vulnerability, and defining one's own worth. So we can also notice how Will was able to slowly accept more balanced thoughts, building a strong therapeutic alliance. And through the therapy sessions, he worked on confronting some of his fears in a more controlled manner.
Okie dokie.
Next slide.
Okie dokie. Thank you so much, Maria. Are you all done?
Yep, all set.
Fantastic. So, as we've gone over, and everybody knows, Will Hunting receives some therapy in the film Good Will Hunting. The therapy he receives in the film is client-centered, humanistic, and he receives it from Sean, played by the legendary Robin Williams. Sean works from a place of radical authenticity, sharing deeply personal stories about his life and dead wife that help him build an alliance with Will. Ultimately, his methods are successful in helping Will break out of the maladaptive behaviors that have kept him stuck in his old life that we've mentioned earlier. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be using CBT to treat Will. CBT is different from the therapy that Will actually receives in the film. It is much more directive and a much more structured modality that relies on empirical data than the therapy that we see Will receive from Sean. What's important to know about CBT is there's a very particular mechanism of change. So given Will's genius level intellect and his trauma history, it's important that any therapist he works with emphasizes collaborative empiricism as the foundation of their working relationship. Collaborative empiricism is a defining feature of CBT. So the dynamic between therapist and client should be that of co-investigators or collaborators, closer to equals, rather than think about an expert and someone who's being educated, or a life coach or consultant. Really, collaborative empiricism requires everybody to try to be kind of working on the same field. This is why we think CBT is going to be really useful for Will. We think he'll appreciate. We think he'll appreciate that kind of alliance. Will's intelligence will mean that he'll probably reject any therapist who'd assert himself as the expert in the room. So CBT allows Will to function as the expert on his own life. Will's primary defense mechanism, which we see in the movie all the time, is to outsmart and alienate clinicians and generally position people in positions of authority, but particularly people who are trying to give him therapy. So yeah, we're trying to deal with that problem before it even happens. Also, Will's a mathematician. He's a very logical guy. Will could also appreciate the empirical element of collaborative empiricism. Trauma history could be looked at through a lens of investigation and data gathering, rather than sort of primarily about feelings and processing feelings. Will and his therapist can work together, testing psychological hypotheses, gathering data, designing interventions, and reviewing results together. So there's a real scientific basis to a lot of this work that we think Will really appreciate, to really appeal to Will and the way that he views the world. Will also is because he's so smart, he's also interested in lots of different topics, and CBT focuses a lot on psychoeducation. We think the emphasis on psychoeducation could be something he'd be really interested in. The kind of end goal of CBT is to give the client enough psychoeducation so that they are interested in themselves and can design their own interventions and conduct their own, behavioral experiments. We also think that this would be appealing to Will. And generally, like, all of this is a note on sort of like potentially easing compliance. Will Hunting is notoriously not a very compliant guy. So yeah, we think this kind of like this end point, this idea that Will is being taught to take care of himself through the lens of psychoeducation would be very appealing to him. So generally, I want to emphasize that delivery here, because of who Will is and what he's like and what his personality is like, and also the fact that he is so intelligent, the delivery of this information is going to be really, really key. Intervention selection, so that Will doesn't become dismissive, is really going to be super, super important. Much more important than it would be, I think, with a regular client or a client of coming from a different place. Will is someone who is quick and intelligent and cutting and isn't going to hold back if he thinks something is stupid. Appealing to his intellect is only going to work with a therapist who can have some kind of equal footing with him and who is truly an expert and can select interventions that are really going to appeal to him, or at least that he can tolerate. And pacing is going to be really, really crucial, so things don't move too fast, too quickly. What's important to know is collaborative imperialism is a foundational tool for CBT. It's not the central mechanism of change. The therapeutic alliance is also a foundational tool of CBT. It's also not the mechanism of change. The core philosophy of CBT is it's not the events themselves that cause distress, but the meaning or interpretation that the client assigns to these events. So CBT looks at the way that we assign meaning to things that we experience. So for someone like Will Hunting, the focus of CBT therapy won't be on his traumatic childhood in and of itself, but the way he interprets or derives meaning from that traumatic childhood. We think that that kind of one step back will really appeal to Will, who isn't necessarily a feelings guy, to sort of put it lightly. According to CBT, Will's maladaptive behaviors, which we've already talked about, violence, avoidant relationships, trouble with the law, caused by negative automatic thoughts that are a product of core beliefs or schemas he has created as a response to trauma. So the mechanism of change in CBT is cognitive modification and skill acquisition. So it's changing the way that you think to change the way that you act. By identifying, challenging, and replacing irrational or negative thoughts with more balanced alternatives, Will experience a reduction in negative emotions and enact negative behavior and stop enacting negative behaviors that have negative outcomes. So essentially, we're trying to help him think about the way he feels, think about the way he interprets events, and think about the way that those thoughts and those feelings impact his behavior, so that those behaviors are negative. So we're trying to change that at its core so it becomes positive and has a positive sort of domino effect all the way down. Essentially, a CBT-focused approach would mean that Will Hunting had a therapist who treated him like an equal in the task of identifying, challenging, and replacing the negative core beliefs and schemas that cause him to be violent and avoidant. So I'm going to jump into treatment here. The first thing that a therapist could do with Will is just really basic agenda setting. It gives sessions structure, but it also fundamentally it gives Will a perception of equal control over each session's agenda. And again, we're always thinking about, easing as much compliance as possible. I think with agenda setting, you have the opportunity there to address Will's sort of need to rebel against authority right out the gate. You position him as the authority in the room and having a lot more control and influence over the sessions. He's not just an inactive participant. It's not just happening to him, he's participating in it. Also, to begin with Will, you would need to begin with some psychoeducation. So at the very outset of sessions, a therapist should teach Will about his thoughts, feelings, and how his thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all interact. Presenting this like a psychodynamic mathematical proof will appeal to Will's intellect, and the emphasis on logic will really help. I wish I was smart enough to be able to set up a psychodynamic mathematical proof. Unfortunately, I'm not, but I think the right kind of therapist would be able to really understand Will's language. And there's a real opportunity with CBT because the emphasis is on logic and data. There is really opportunities for synergy there that I think if treated the right way, could be really, really, really good for a client like Will. So moving on, you would then want to move into some really basic cognitive restructuring with Will. We've talked about his self-blame. We've talked about his low self-worth. Really his self-blame about the abuse he suffered in the foster system, at the hands of a foster father. That's really sort of like ground zero of his psychological distress. And in my opinion, really is kind of the most impactful thing that is needing to change. So addressing this with cognitive restructuring, I think, is kind of the smart move. There are a bunch of different ways and interventions that CBT will allow us to do that. The first is the double standard technique. The double standard technique, so you would want to ask Will to imagine another 7-year-old child, ideally someone that he grew up with and is really still friends with and feels really caring or protective over. So Chucky or Billy are pretty good examples for this. So he would imagine Chucky or Billy experiencing the same exact abuse that Will suffered from his foster father. The therapist would have to work really slowly and really entice Will to spend time really imagining his abuse happening to a child version of his friend, for this to be most impactful. The therapist would then ask Will if he would tell Chucky it was his fault for being mouthy, or for not doing something right, or for getting into trouble. The hope here is that forcing Will to apply his own maladaptive logic to someone that he feels protective over will cause a cognitive dissonance that might help break the self-blame cycle. The next thing that a therapist could do is hindsight bias. So suggesting to Will in the course of a session that he's probably evaluating his past trauma using the knowledge, strength, and resources that he has now, rather than what was available to him then as a kid. So Will could be blaming himself for not fighting back or for provoking the abuser. He probably is. I think we see that in a couple scenes that he definitely is. The therapist would question the assertion that Will should have fought back or should have not provoked him. Would question that assertion with logical questions to help Will understand that he survived the best way he could with what was available to him at the time. And a lot of his behavior was probably developmentally appropriate, and a lot of the demands on him were unfair as he was a child. So the hope with this was that you would neutralize some of the shame that contributes to the self-blame. Another thing that you could do, capitalizing on Will's love of math, is you could draw up a responsibility pie chart, which is, in sessions you draw a big pie chart, which and then assign percentages of responsibility for the childhood abuse. At the moment, that whole pie chart would just be Will. He holds 100% of the blame. A visual representation of that might help might make the weight of that blame hit home for him. But a therapist, if it doesn't have impact right there, then a therapist would work with Will to sort of systematically and logically reassign portions of the pie to each responsible party until Will actually holds none of the blame, hopefully reducing the internalized feelings of guilt. Again, this would require Will's participation, and it would be something that would be broken down slowly and digested slowly, for sort of maximum impact. Of course, Socratic questioning is a fundamental part of CBT and would probably be used across all of these interventions. But a particular intervention here would be when Will expresses that his Southie friends would see him as a sellout for taking a corporate math job. A therapist would use guided discovery to test out his logic and evidence of this assumption. So, what have your friends actually said? What have they actually done? What are their actual attitudes in the real world? What evidence do you actually have? So those are sort of all the cognitive interventions. The behavioral interventions, because Will's a genius, there's a lot of potential here, but he also defaults to assuming he's always right, because as a genius, he very often is right. So a therapist would have to sort of entice Will into testing his assumptions in the real world to assess his accuracy. And again, the hope is that if we can do this in a way that's scientific, that it will appeal to Will's love of logic. The most obvious here is to set up some behavior experiments. Around Skylar, these I think would be the most useful. So a therapist would challenge Will to come up with a hypothesis and test about his relationship with Skylar. His hypothesis might be, if I open up my life and my world to Skylar, she'll be disgusted and leave me. A therapist might suggest a graded exposure task where Will plans specific activities with Skylar and then makes notes of the results, what she does, and then sit down and think, does his catastrophic prediction actually match reality? What does the data actually say? There's a great potential there for some fun graphs if for the mathematically minded therapist. But essentially, Will would collect this data and challenge his own internal assumptions about the way that Skylar would react. And then a therapist and Will go over this in session and be able to assess empirically whether his hypothesis was accurate. And if his hypothesis was inaccurate, what are the implications of that? And what does that mean moving forward? Another potential behavioral intervention here is values clarification. We've talked about Will staying in his comfort zone and Will sort of feeling stagnant. A huge part of that is an attempt to avoid immense pressure that comes with his intellectual potential and the sort of like high expectations of the people around him who realize how smart he is. So a suggestion here would be values mapping, so that he could separate, what Will wants for himself and what Professor Lambo wants for Will, and where those two things come together and where they might actually veer completely apart. And processing what that could mean for Will going forward. Another thing here was cognitive diffusion. So the therapist and Will would spend time working on a technique so that Will could observe his thoughts without reacting to them. A therapist would teach Will to understand when a thought was a trauma response not based in reality, so the thought shouldn't be treated like a fact. So essentially, this is trigger management, which is really important for Will, as we've talked about his aggression and the trouble that's got him in. And really, the treatment plan would end with coming up with an action plan as Will grows and develops and moves forward. Will and the therapist would work very closely to come up with some concrete strategies for Will to utilize when he feels the urge to self-sabotage or emotionally withdraw. The idea is to give Will a toolbox of behaviors that he can use to soothe himself and to also be able to understand the sources of his thoughts so that it can inform his behavior so he can make better choices. So, of course, we should anticipate we're going to run into some therapy interfering behavior. This is a pretty comprehensive plan that I think will address Will's self-blame, self-sabotage, rebelliousness, avoidant tendencies. It's all the stuff that we've identified through this presentation as the issue. The therapist, I think, would anticipate, running into a couple of several therapy interfering behaviors. For a CBT therapist, they would understand those behaviors as direct manifestations of maladaptive schema. A couple that you, as a therapist would assume that they were going to meet would be defensive,ness and intellectualization. Will's going to kind of lean on his tried and true methods of dealing with discomfort. We have to anticipate that Will's going to mock some interventions, probably try and outsmart the therapist. Those are sort of his classic tools. And these should be dealt with directly by the therapist and just addressed very neutrally in the moment, in the session, so that they don't get bigger, and also so there isn't an overreaction, and also to create a feeling of safety, right? That like the therapist notices what Will is doing and addresses it, but there isn't trouble. The therapist should also assume that Will's going to potentially conveniently forget to do his homework or his behavioral experiments, at least to begin with, and he might hyperbolize some of his self-reporting for fun or to get a reaction. All of this should be explored directly in session. Fundamental to this therapeutic treatment and approach is hopefully the idea that everything between the therapist and Will is mutually agreed upon. Having that mutual agreement with a client like Will is going to make a huge difference just in terms of his buy-in. And then in terms of the way that we measure change and the way that we see that we're meeting our goals, the best thing about CBT is it's evidence-based and it's empirical. So we could measure this change through concrete data. Evidence of change would be available in Will's self-reporting. So we could have him do mood trackers. We could have him do thought records. really the biggest evidence of change for a client like Will is when he starts acting in line with his values rather than his fears. So making progress with Skylar or going to see about a girl. All of that would count. When Will demonstrates more cognitive flexibility and can encounter a trigger and independently use interventions to calm down instead of lashing out, that will be fundamentally, evidence of change occurring. Annie, it's on to you now.
All right, thank you. Sorry, can we just switch the slide?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. So just a quick summary of kind of how CBT will address Will's needs. CBT will hopefully tackle Will's core difficulties by making kind of his hidden beliefs and thoughts, which drive his anger, mistrust, and avoidance, more explicit, and then systematically testing and reshaping them, using a structured, goal-oriented format like CBT. It will give Will clear, evidence-based steps to regulate his emotions, replace maladaptive cognitions, and practice new relational behaviors through behavioral experiments. And by having the therapist as a collaborative partnership, the CBT will kind of leverage on Will's high intellectual strengths, while also building a supportive alliance that encourages active participation and self-discovery throughout the sessions. And then together with all these elements, they will address his aggression, defensive stance towards authority, relational avoidance, and academic stagnation. And also providing some skills and a framework toward healthier thinking behavior and improved relationships. And however, there are a few gaps and limitations of CBT for Will. Specifically, first, there's a risk of reinforcing defenses. Will's high intellect has the ability to lead him to rely heavily on intellectualization as a coping strategy. So when therapy is presented as a logical thought restructuring exercise, he can outthink the process, remaining in his cognitive comfort zone while avoiding genuine emotional experience. Second, relational depth. The core main trauma that is driving his distress, such as experiences from his childhood, mainly neglect and abandonment, especially in the foster care system, are rooted in early attachment trauma. So CBT's emphasis on symptom reduction, skill building, often do not provide the corrective, emotionally attuned therapeutic relationship needed to repair or work on these deep-rooted issues. And then third, present-focused orientation. So mainly CBT is known for addressing more like the present rather than past problems. So it often will address current anger, impulsivity, and legal concerns. More of a here and now stance can leave the underlying historically rooted trauma underprocessed. So without dedicated work on past memories, the therapy may not only mask rather than resolve the deep-rooted issues. So in summary, CBT's structured, goal-oriented approach aligns well with Will's analytical style, offering concrete tools and measurable outcomes that can be directly observed throughout the treatment process. CBT is valued for its systemic brief and evidence-based approach to modifying dysfunctional thinking and behavior. So now that we've outlined the CBT formulation and treatment plan, we will now demonstrate 2 core CBT techniques in a role play style portion of the presentation with Will.